1920s. Just a quick note here, you'll see that this is covering chapter 23 in your book and chapter 24 in your book. This is because I combined these all into kind of one big lesson over the 1920s, so to speak. And so I admittedly jumped back and forth between chapter 23 and 24, so just giving you that disclaimer up front. In 1920 and 1921, we're going to see America is facing a severe post-war depression, but really after those 2 years, the American economy is going to boom for the remainder of the decade. However, as much as we talk about like the roaring 20s and everything, this prosperity is not going to be evenly distributed. So we're going to have, first of all, our factories. With all of the profits from the war, basically this is going to allow a lot of businesses to mechanize. And with this mechanization, you get mass production spreading across all kinds of industries. And with machine-made standardized parts and assembly lines, this is basically increasing these industries' efficiency and their production. So that's going back to that whole ideals of the gospel of efficiency with the progressive era. So there you go. Also, on top of that, the nation is going to more than double its capacity to generate electricity during this decade as well, which helps economically in, making standardized parts and mechanization and everything. But also it means you get electricity in homes, which brings a demand for all kinds of new products. The thing is, when we're looking at mass production of items, this goes hand in hand with consumption. And it's not even necessarily electricity, but electricity does play into it. So it's going to be things like people want electric sewing machines, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, any kind of labor-saving appliance, basically. We're also going to see some big industries helping drive the economy at this time, such as the automobile industry. This really helps a lot of different people and a lot of different sectors in industry, because it's going to be things like you need construction workers and all the materials for the construction of roads. When you're building different automobiles themselves, you need glass, steel, rubber, and then of course you need the petroleum industries as well. But then you also need like garages and service stations for the automobiles on top of all that. Plus, a lot of times this is going to bring about the construction of houses more and more often. And so with cars, there's a greater migration from the cities to the suburbs. On top of that, you can see a lot of those same items are going to go into the aviation industry during this time period as well. We're going to see other industries as well really growing at this time, such as like the chemical industry. America basically confiscated some chemical patents from German firms at the end of World War I, and so they're going to transfer a lot of these patents to United States companies like DuPont. And so you might be going, what does chemicals do? Well, that's going to be doing things like making plastics, finishes, dyes, all kinds of organic chemicals, cellophane for packaged goods, things like that. And then last but not least, we have on here our radio motion picture industries. First of all, you're going to have, commercial broadcasting with the radio industry, and a lot of, corporations want to dominate those radio waves. Then, of course, there's controlling radio manufacturing itself. And then for the motion picture industry, this actually was one of the nation's 5 largest businesses during the 1920s. You have to think it's not just the actual movies themselves, but it's the movie theaters, the ticket sales, the Hollywood studios, directors, writers, camera crews, actors. And then when you get talking movies later in the decade, this means even more profits and power, especially to these major studios like Paramount. Now, we're also going to see during the 20s a wave of corporate mergers, just like we had seen at the turn of the century. We're going to see corporations basically swallow up thousands of small firms. And we're not going to see necessarily monopolies, but we're going to see the spread of oligopolies. Oligopolies is basically the control of an entire industry by like a few giant firms. So they're competing against each other, but they're not really they've eliminated that competition from smaller firms. Some examples of this is going to be things like the automobile industry, electric light and power, but also in things like finance and marketing during this time period. Now, the difference during the 1920s compared to the turn of the century, though, is that during the 20s, there was actually very little public fear or opposition to all of these mergers. And in fact, most people supported them on the idea that the size of a corporation actually helped bring more efficiency and productivity to that particular industry. Just a quick note here, all of these things that we're going to be talking about in the 20s are really setting up for the Great Depression. So kind of make note of these things that sometimes people aren't worried about, but maybe they should be. We're also during this time period going to see businesses really moving against labor, especially now that World War I was over. So we're going to see things like open shop campaigns that would try to break up union shop contracts that would have required all employees to be union members. And instead, union membership would not be required anymore. And in fact, a lot of businesses would try to prohibit it. They'd say, oh, it's un-American to join a union. They'd do things like force their workers, in fact, to sign yellow dog contracts, which would actually be that they had to explicitly reject being in a union to keep their jobs. And we even see things like companies boycotting other companies that employed union labor. So think about this like in the automobile industry. If you're building cars, you could boycott a glass manufacturer who allowed union membership, things like that. We see all kinds of ways that businesses tried to crush these unions. They might use spies or hire strike breakers. And then a lot of companies are basically going to try to offer some sort of alternative to the unions. So it'd be like they might establish their own medical services or insurance programs or pension plans or vacation days for workers. They might establish like employee social clubs and sports teams. And all of this was really about undercutting union membership and thus have their workers rely on the corporation a lot more. You even get as another alternative company unions. So this would be management-sponsored substitutes for labor unions. The problem is a lot of these company unions would be forbidden from handling like wage or hour issues, so the really big issues. And really more than anything else, these were just about undermining real unionism. We're going to see, because of all of this, membership of labor unions falls drastically throughout the 1920s. And it didn't help either that the unions that are going to stay in place, more and more are going to neglect ethnic and black workers and women workers. In fact, in 1921, we're going to see unemployment is about 12%. Now, really quick, unemployment, you always want to have some sort of unemployment, mostly because you want, if there's zero unemployment, that means that there's a demand for workers and there's not enough people to fill that demand. So you want to have some unemployment, but you really don't want to get unemployment rates in the double digits. And so that was a real concern in 1921. And like I said, beginning of the decade, you have a slight depression and everything. On top of that, during that time period, hours are remaining long. Generally, people worked more than 50 hours a week. And when you look at throughout the entirety of the decade, wages don't really increase. When we see increases in wages during the 1920s, it's generally before 1923. And then really what you see after that is falling prices of items, but not raising wages. And this is a problem because productivity is increasing, thus making items cheaper to buy. But if you have no raise in wages, this actually threatens a nation's long-term prosperity. You need wages to match inflation, or honestly do even better if at all possible. Now the thing is, some people are going to fare much worse than others. So for instance, ethnic minorities, black workers, women workers all do worse. Generally, workers in the South tend to do worse. And so we're seeing that gap between the really rich and the really poor widening during this time period. And on top of that, we're seeing consumer credit expanding during the decade. A lot of people are buying on credit. So keep that in mind when we're coming towards the setup of the Great Depression and everything. In fact, I should mention, providing consumer credit was the nation's 10th largest business in 1929. We also have a few industries that were, quite frankly, sick during this time period, and they just dragged down on the economy. These are going to be industries like coal mining, textile and garment manufacturing, and railroads. The big issue with a lot of these industries was just excess capacity. So it'd be like having too many mines or too many factories, and yet there's a shrinking demand. So too much supply, not enough demand. And so this equals low returns. And then a lot of these industries are facing a lot of like management versus labor conflicts. A big industry, if you can call it an industry, that's going to drag on the economy is going to be agriculture, actually. It really never recovers from the 1921 depression. The problem is there's going to be crop surpluses after World War I due to things like fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, but then all of those foreign markets are going to dry up after the war because a lot of the European people go home and they start planting their own wheat and their own food. And so this means that we're just seeing a shrinking demand plus surplus of food means the price of food is going down. So small farmers just were unable to compete, and a lot of them are going to lose their land and basically become tenants on the land or farm hands. In fact, by 1930, only 57% of American farmers owned the land that they worked, and this is the lowest percentage in American history ever. And then, of course, you also have to look at some specific groups within this. There's going to be a lot of discrimination towards Black and Hispanic tenants of the land, or sharecroppers or farm workers. They're going to be the ones that are the most exploited, and they have the poorest wages, and of course they live in terrible living conditions and generally are going to face racism in their day-to-day life. So far, think about how you could characterize the 1920s work in one sentence.